Hi everyone, and welcome to the weekly CosmoQuest Science Hour. I'm Jason Davis, and I'll be filling in for Emily Lakdawalla this week. For today's show, we're going to be talking about commercial spaceflight, and my guest is a space industry analyst. You can find him writing a lot of places, but you can find him writing long-form articles at Space Review, and that's www.thespacereview.com. Writing about commercial spaceflight at New Space Journal, and that's newspacejournal.com. And he also does a little space politics over at spacepolitics.com. He also tweets prolifically, and if there is a congressional hearing on space, you are almost guaranteed to find him live covering that. So, Jeff Foust, welcome to the program, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Jason.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand that I'm keeping you from what sounds like maybe a fun evening in Washington, D.C. tonight. Yeah,
well, you know, you got dibs on this time slot. About a day after I accepted this, got an invitation. SpaceX is hosting a reception in downtown Washington this evening, and they've got the Dragon that flew to the International Space Station back in May on display. So nice little party, chance to see some flight hardware, but here with you and everyone else watching.
All right.
So no pressure to make this a good evening.
Yeah, you know? I know, yeah. And then to make it matters worse, I saw Elon Musk had tweeted a picture of it, and it was under neon lights and looked beautiful and everything, and I was like, oh boy, I'd better make this a wonderful experience for everyone here.
I'm sure it'll be fine.
Okay. So before we officially get started, I just wanted to remind everyone watching, if you can please +1 the Hangout on Google+, and if you have questions for Jeff, please post them on there, and we'll try to take the last few minutes of the show to get to them. So I thought I'd start off by asking you more of a personal question. You have 3 blogs, space news site, you tweet, you follow the commercial space industry so thoroughly, and you're always popping up at industry events, and you have a day job, right? Or some kind of day job?
That's right. That's right.
So how do you do all that?
Sleep a little bit. But, I mean, this is a very interesting industry personally for me. It's a very fascinating time also. It's a very dynamic time. There's a lot of change going on. We're seeing new companies rise up, new industries rise up, a very different way of approaching spaceflight now than we have really in the first 50 years of the space age.
Mm-hmm.
We're really seeing now new models for doing business, new technologies. It's really a dynamic time, so it makes it very interesting to watch and try and see what's going to happen, what companies, what approaches are going to come out on top in the coming years. So it's really fascinating, and I think it's going to really shape the next 50 years of spaceflight.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really seeing history being made here with the Dragon coming back from the space station. That was pretty amazing to see that work for the first time. I totally agree with you. So yeah, I thought I would ask you first of all. I know you follow Virgin Galactic pretty closely, or it seems like I've seen you tweeting from their events before. Your profile picture, I think, is in front of Spaceship One.
It's White Knight 2 carrier aircraft.
Yeah. So there was some big news from them a couple weeks ago, or big in the sense that it was publicly announced. They're going to be competing with a carrier rocket in the private spaceflight market. So for those of you watching that aren't familiar with the concept, Orbital Sciences does this. They fly a plane with the launch vehicle strapped underneath of it, fly it out over the ocean, drop it, the booster ignites and sends the rocket into orbit. So Virgin Galactic is going to be trying something similar. So Jeff, maybe you could tell us what you know about that and maybe how it's going to differ.
Sure. They have a project. It's called Launcher One, and they announced it last week at the Farnborough Air Show outside of London. And the idea is to use the White Knight 2 carrier aircraft, which is the same aircraft that's going to carry Spaceship Two aloft, for the suborbital space tourism and research flights. But replace Spaceship 2 with an expendable rocket. It'll be a two-stage rocket. It'll be able to place satellites weighing up to a couple hundred kilograms in the low Earth orbit. The goal is to provide access to small satellites at a much lower cost than most of the other options available today. They're talking at a price less than $10 million. They really haven't been more specific about that, but they're talking about less than $10 million. A Pegasus launch is going to cost a few times that amount at the minimum. It can carry a little bit more, 300, 400, 500 kilograms, but it's considerably more expensive. And one of the issues with small satellites, it's been a very dynamic growing field in recent years as technologies enable smaller satellites weighing 100 kilograms, 10 kilograms, even CubeSats that can literally fit in the palm of your hand to fly into space and do useful missions. The challenge, though, has been getting those satellites into space. It's very expensive space access. It's very difficult for small satellites to get a ride because obviously it makes no sense for them to use a dedicated large rocket like an Atlas or a Delta. They're also very expensive as well. So they have the choice of either using something like a Pegasus, which is still pretty expensive, or try and fly as what's called a secondary payload, basically hitchhike their way into space on someone else's launch.
And we saw that
discount that way.
We saw that during the Falcon 9 launch, didn't we? Some CubeSats came along for the rides.
I know they've talked about doing that. I don't remember the specifics for the recent SpaceX launch, but yeah, they're certainly planning for future missions to carry small satellites as secondary payloads, and a number of other launches do that as well. But you're sort of restricted to whatever rockets you can find that have the space available to carry secondary payload. And then you also have to be able to find one that wants to go in the orbit you want to go into. If someone's going into a particular orbit that's good for, say, a communication satellite, but you want to go into a more inclined orbit for remote sensing, observing the Earth, your choices of launches gets even slimmer. So the idea to have a dedicated launch for small satellites and to be able to do it on an affordable price point is something that a lot of people in the industry have been interested in, and Virgin thinks that the Launcher One concept is going to be able to do that. It's going to be able to provide that dedicated launch at a low enough price, and we'll see how the market responds to that. They certainly, as part of the announcement last week, they announced they've lined up several customers, one of them being Planetary Resources, which is the asteroid mining company that announced back in April that's going to start off by putting some satellites into Earth orbit to do basically prospecting, to be able to observe near-Earth asteroids and look for ones that would be promising targets for future missions. And so that Launcher One mission would be a good way for them to get some of those satellites on the orbit fairly inexpensively as they start their process.
And so I assume this will be based out of the Mojave Spaceport with the rest of Virgin's operations?
Well, they're probably going to fly out of Spaceport America in New Mexico, which is going to be the operating base for Virgin Galactic when they start the actual space tourism flights. Okay. One of the advantages of air launch is you can take off from a place like Spaceport America in New Mexico, and you can fly some distance to get over to get into the right place where you can launch a rocket and make sure the stages fall over uninhabited territory or ocean. But they're talking about also being able to launch or fly out of, if you will, other sites in the U.S. as well. And they may also fly outside the U.S. Later on. That gets into some export control issues of basically exporting a rocket and outside the U.S., which is can be a bit of a challenging prospect.
Yeah. Do you know what kind of hardware the rocket will be based on? Will it be a solid rocket like orbitals, or will it be a liquid-fueled rocket?
They've talked about using a liquid fuel rocket, which is a slightly different approach than they're using for Spaceship 2. Spaceship 2 uses what's called a hybrid rocket motor. It's the same sort of technology that they used with Spaceship 1 that won the X Prize back in 2004, which has a solid fuel, basically something similar to rubber, and nitrous oxide liquid oxidizer. That's what they're using for Spaceship 2. They're going to use a little bit more conventional liquid rocket engine for this Launcher One vehicle. They haven't talked much about the technical details yet about the Launcher One concept, so I'm sure we'll hear some more specifics as to how they're planning to develop that in the weeks and months to come.
Sure. And we also have, they'll be facing another competitor, which would be Stratolaunch, correct? Which is the Paul Allen venture that will do something similar?
Stratolaunch is basically air launch on steroids. It's the same sort of concept. You have a carrier aircraft that takes a rocket aloft, then drops the rocket off, the rocket fires off and goes up into space. But with Stratolaunch, they're going to build a new carrier aircraft that will be one of the largest aircraft ever built. They're basically taking components from two 747s to help build this aircraft, taking things like the jet engines and
a Spruce situation, kind of.
Yeah. And then for the rocket, it's going to be a modified version of SpaceX's Falcon 9. SpaceX is actually going to provide the rocket for that. It'll be sort of a slimmed-down version with not the 9 engines in the first stage that the Falcon 9 has. It might be 4 or 5 engines. But it's going to provide something that's going to be much heavier capacity. It's going to carry several tons in low Earth orbit as opposed to a couple hundred kilograms.
And thus, I assume it will be the slightly more expensive option for providers?
Yeah, it'll be a more expensive option. They haven't talked too much about prices for launches other than that they plan to be competitive with existing rockets in that class. It's bigger. It would be too big really for the really small satellites that people are talking about using now, but it might be interesting as sort of an alternative for sending supplies to the space station or some other orbiting facility. Some people have speculated that you could take the Air Force's X-37B, their secret spy plane that launched a couple times on an Atlas V, and stick that on the nose of the rocket instead. If you want to do whatever missions the Air Force is doing that they're not talking about with the X-37. So there'd be some applications. That would probably fly out, at least initially, the Kennedy Space Center, because they need, as you might imagine with an aircraft that size, they need a long runway. And the runway at the Kennedy Space Center used for the shuttle landings would be a good fit for something like that.
And would they also be able to do polar launches from the East Coast, assuming they flew out far enough into the ocean?
Yeah, if they flew out far enough in the ocean, that's one of the advantages of air launches. You do have some flexibility that if you can't launch from a certain inclination, a certain direction from a fixed land site, you can fly out some distance basically and then take a turn and then launch. That's something, for example, that Pegasus does. You know, it's carried aloft on a converted L-1011 jet, and it can fly out of multiple facilities into pretty much almost any direction, any inclination that you want to go.
Very interesting. What's your take on how soon we will see this happen? I mean, what is the Boyle's Law? We're always 2 years out for these wonderful solutions.
Yeah, I think for the air launch systems, we're a little bit more than 2 years out. Both Stratolaunch and Virgin with their Launcher One are talking about middle of the decade, so probably more like 2016 or so before these vehicles are ready for test flights or to begin service. So these are still a few years off, and one of the challenges is going to be how the market is going to change for space launch over the next several years. If SpaceX, for example, is very successful with the Falcon 9, they could basically undercut themselves to some degree in terms of providing launches that might be less expensive than what Stratolaunch can provide, or provide a greater capacity at the same price, which might be an interesting way how that market will shape up. Likewise, with the small satellite market, there's a lot of interest in small satellites still, but again, one of the challenges is finding that right price point for a dedicated launch. You might remember SpaceX started a decade ago with a much smaller rocket called the Falcon 1. The Falcon 1 was initially going to put about 500 kilograms or so into low Earth orbit. For the initial price was $6 million. That went up a little bit over time. It eventually became, they eventually came up with something called the Falcon 1E, which is a sort of a upscale version of the Falcon 1 that could put closer to 1,000 kilograms into orbit for $10 million. SpaceX set that aside because they said they couldn't find the customers for it. Also, you look at what SpaceX was doing. They're focusing much more on Dragon and Falcon 9. Having a separate, smaller launch vehicle becomes a little bit of a distraction if there isn't a lot of business there. So the question is, at whatever price below 10 million that Virgin is talking about with Launcher 1, will that be enough to generate enough demand to make it worth their while to do that on top of all the Spaceship One flights that they're going to be doing for space tourism and also for suborbital research?
Yeah, and speaking of those space tourism flights, what's your impression on the timeline for those? It seems like that keeps getting delayed a little bit as well.
Yeah, that's where the Boyle's Law you're talking about being 2 years out has come into play. I think we're within, though, that 2-year period now.
Yeah.
If you look, for example, at what Virgin is doing. They've stepped up the pace of their test flights. They've been recently doing a series of glide tests with Spaceship Two, where they take it off with White Knight 2, release it, and let it glide back down to the runway, basically to test its handling characteristics. They are doing more rocket motor tests on the ground. They're really starting to look like they're getting closer to start doing powered flight tests towards the end of this year. We'll see how that works out. But you also have X-Core, which is basically next door to Scale Composites, which is building Spaceship Two, White Knight 2 at Mojave Airport. They're working on their Lynx space plane, which is a little different concept. It takes off under its own rocket power from a runway, basically shoots straight up. The first one is under development right now. They're talking about beginning taxi tests and then flight tests towards the end of this year, so you can see that they're getting closer to flight. And they also recently had a major announcement that they're going to set up a research and development facility and set up their headquarters in Midland, Texas. They got a nice deal from the local development agency that's charged with bringing new businesses to the city. Gave them a great deal on some hangar space and some other incentives to get them to set up some operations there. So some of the future work that they're doing after this initial Lynx prototype is going to be done out in Midland, Texas. So
what makes
they're making
Texas
some progress.
What makes Texas such a draw for some of these companies? I mean, you have SpaceX with a location there. I believe Blue Origin has a location somewhere there in rural Texas. Is it the tax breaks and the sheer amount of land available that makes it so appealing?
Part of it, I think, is and what the X-Core officials admitted to in the press conference last week, they announced it, part of it is the business climate there. It is, there's some good tax deals. It's what they, call more business-friendly than a place like California, which has a much stronger regulatory environment. A lot more regulations you have to deal with as a business there than in a place like Texas. That's one thing. Part of it's also the open space. In the case of Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos was able to basically buy up something on the order of 100,000 acres of empty ranch land out in West Texas for his own private testing facility. With it, and no worrying about any pesky neighbors that either they might drop debris on or might simply be spying on what they're doing. So it's a nice thing to have.
It's the space age version of homesteading back in the day.
and it was something actually I recently just this week wrote about in the Space Review. Texas initially hadn't been paying a lot of attention to these new space companies. The real focus, Texas had been considered a quote-unquote space state, but the real focus had been on NASA and the activities around the Johnson Space Center in Houston. More recently, they've started to become a little bit more welcoming to these new space companies to really, I think, diversify that part of their economy. SpaceX has for a long time had a rocket engine testing facility near Waco. That actually used to belong before SpaceX to another entrepreneurial space company called Beale Aerospace that around the late 90s was working on a rocket of its own before they decided to pull out of that business. And SpaceX earlier this year has expressed interest in creating a new launch facility on the Gulf Coast near Brownsville, Texas.
What would give them an advantage for launching from that area?
Well, I mean, one advantage is that it would basically be their own facility. If they launch from the Cape, they have to share the facilities at the Cape with all the other customers there. There's NASA there. There's United Launch Alliance with the Atlas and Delta rockets there. There are other military uses of the range there. So they basically have to make a reservation, sort of like you're trying to make a reservation at a popular restaurant weeks in advance to secure a launch date. Whereas if you have your own dedicated facility, you can launch basically whenever you're ready to go. You don't have to worry about sharing a launch pad or a launch range with other customers. So there's a certain flexibility to do that, and if you're planning to do launches at a fairly high frequency, which is what SpaceX is talking about doing eventually, then having that own dedicated site really starts to become an advantage.
And if you have your own dedicated facility like that, do you have to still bring the Air Force in to approve your launches? You have the Rock out west at Vandenberg and all of that, or is it just come as you go?
Well, you'll have to coordinate with people like the FAA to make sure that the airspace is clear, and if there's any sort of ranges, downrange of the launch site out in the ocean that you might be dropping rocket stages in, for example, to provide notifications so that some fishing boat isn't in the wrong place at the wrong time. Occasionally launches get delayed at the Cape because you'll hear during a countdown that the range is red. And that's usually because some boat has drifted into a keep-out zone that they missed or somehow overlooked that the notice that they send out in advance saying stay out of a particular box in the ocean off the coast of the launch site because they're going to be doing a launch, and they'll delay a launch or sometimes have to scrub for the day because of an issue like that.
Because of a boater.
So you still have to coordinate those issues, but the flexibility of having your own launch site starts to become compelling if, like SpaceX plans to do, doing a large number of launches, so you don't have to worry about sharing with other users.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Interesting. Well, taking a break and maybe shifting gears a little bit here. Definitely wanted to talk to you about NASA's Commercial Crew Program. This one really has my interest. I'm very interested to see what happens next, and it seems like there's been a little chatter back and forth on that subject. So for our viewers, just to catch you up, so we've been through 2 rounds of funding in our Commercial Crew Program from NASA. There was CCDEV 2, and the current players are SpaceX, Boeing, Sierra Nevada, and Blue Origin, if I'm not mistaken. Got all those right. And we also have a couple unfunded agreements that are going on with NASA with United Launch Alliance, kind of working in tandem to hoist Boeing capsules and maybe the Dream Chaser, and then also ATK with their Liberty launcher. So the 3rd round of funding should be announced somewhat soon, but I don't know the date on that. I don't know if you do, Jeff, or if they've even said.
It could be tomorrow. It could be a month from now. But we're sort of in the window at this point in time when we expect NASA to make some awards for this 3rd round. It's called the Commercial Crew Integrated Capability, or the sort of pseudo acronym is CCICAP. So if you hear people talking about CCICAP, this is what they're referring to. And this is going to be up to 3 awards that NASA is going to make under the CCICAP program. And this is really to cover the continued development of the launch vehicle spacecraft concept that would be able to carry crews to the International Space Station.
So unlike earlier funding, just to cut in for a sec, unlike the earlier rounds, this is a fully end-to-end solution, not just like a piece of the launch abort system or something like that. This is the full deal.
This is really to get that full integrated concept, the spacecraft and launch vehicle, really up to the point where they can actually start bending metal, start actually putting it together, developing the initial vehicle for flight tests. And again, there's been some controversy about this because some in Congress have sought NASA to try and and select as few as one company to basically conserve the funding that's available in an effort to try and advance the time that a vehicle would be ready to service a space station. The idea being that if you only gave out one award, you could give that company more money and that would accelerate the process. NASA's wanted to give more awards basically to spread out the risk. They don't want to be reliant on a single company in the way that we're reliant right now on the Russians with the Soyuz spacecraft to access the space station. They would like to have ideally at least two companies out there, believing that there would be enough demand from NASA's business carrying astronauts to and from the space station, as well as other commercial business, space tourism. Bigelow Aerospace has its plans for space stations, carrying astronauts from other countries that don't have their own spaceflight capability to be able to support a couple of companies through that mix of customers. And the agreement that NASA worked out with a key member of Congress who basically, he chairs the subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee whose oversight includes NASA. So he's basically got a very firm grasp on the purse strings for the agency. Worked out a deal that NASA could give what they call 2.5 awards. They'll be able to give 2 full-size awards to companies, and they'll be able to give a third half-size award to another company to keep it sort of going along at a slower pace than it would be if it got a full-size award, but to keep them in play just in case one of the 2 companies that got full-size awards faltered for one reason or another.
So do you think,
providing a little bit of insurance.
Gotcha. Do you think there are implied companies for these? You know, do they secretly already know who the half is going to be and who the fools are going to be, or what's your take on that? Is it all decided, or no?
There's a lot of speculation right now about what companies will get what awards. You know, if there's one sure thing, or close to a sure thing as possible, is that it would be very surprising if SpaceX didn't get an award, simply because they've demonstrated the Dragon spacecraft already with its flight to the space station. That is going to be effectively the same craft that they'll use for the crewed missions with some modifications primarily inside, full life support systems, seats, for example, things like that. But they built the Dragon from the beginning to have the ability to carry people in the first place. So it's not like they're really retrofitting something from scratch, but they're really building upon something that they've already developed. And the fact that they've successfully demonstrated it suggests that they've got an inside track for one of the awards. Now the question would be, would NASA feel that they're far enough along that they can give them a half award and give 2 full-size awards to other companies, or would they get 1 full-size award because they've demonstrated their capabilities already? That's very much an open question. It's very much a guessing game. But Boeing and Sierra Nevada Corporation have really been pushing for these awards as well. Blue Origin, which is the 4th company that got one of these funded awards in the 2nd round, it's probably very much a dark horse. I'd be very surprised if they got an award. They really haven't been playing up seeking the CCI cap award like the other companies have. And then you have ATK, which earlier this year announced a full-fledged Liberty system, that they're going to have not just the Liberty rocket, which they announced last year, but a spacecraft to go on top. And they're one of the companies that had the unfunded Space Act agreements you were referring to earlier. They're certainly in play to get one of these funded CCI cap awards. United Launch Alliance probably won't, because they're partnered with Boeing and Sierra Nevada and Blue Origin, and since they're looking for an integrated capability, they would be partnered with them rather than getting a separate award. And there's also one other company out there that did get an unfunded 2nd round CCDEV agreement. It's called Excalibur Almaz. It's a very interesting company that they're based in the Isle of Man. So they're part of the UK, but under a little different taxing jurisdiction, so it's a fairly business-friendly environment. They've gotten access to some former Soviet hardware that they're looking, these ALMAs, space station modules that the Soviets developed back in the 1970s. They'd like to put them onto any one of a number of existing launch vehicles and use them for carrying people into space. Mm-hmm. It's not clear if they're bidding for CCICAP or not. They have their own business plans which are separate from servicing the space station. In fact, they've talked about doing circumlunar missions, carrying people around the moon, similar to what Space Adventures has been talking about in recent years. So that might be what they're going after. But again, they're sort of like Blue Origin, a dark horse out there for the CCICAP competition. But you really have, I think, SpaceX, Boeing, Sierra Nevada, and ATK as 4 companies, and one of them is probably going to be left out. If there's only going to be 2.5 awards, 3 of those 4 companies will get at least some award. 1/4 company won't get an award, and then they'll have to make a decision about whether or not they want to proceed with the development of the system entirely with private funding, or fold up and not pursue it any further. So that's going to be a hard decision that one of those companies is going to face, and sometime in the next several weeks once the CCICAP awards are announced.
Do you think there's any tendency or pressure by NASA to select someone from the old guard, or someone with a familiar name, implying Boeing, with a partnership with the United Launch Alliance,
or ATK,
right? Which has done shuttle SRBs, and
right.
Do you think there's any pressure to pick those, or is that the preference of some of these senators in these backroom meetings, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, different members of Congress are going to have different preferences about who they want to pick based on basically who's in their district. People in Colorado, for example, are going to be supportive of Sierra Nevada because they're based there. Obviously, Southern California is very interested in SpaceX. Utah has been a strong supporter of ATK, so because they manufacture the solid rocket motors out there. So depending on where you are, depending on where you sit depends on where you stand in a case like this. So that's going to play a factor. But really NASA's they have to look at they're going to have several criteria looking at this. They're going to have to look at the technical viability of these systems, and also the viability, the ability of these companies to say what they're going to be able to do. They can actually carry that out. And if their business plans are feasible, can they really, NASA does not want to be in the position where they're the sole customer for a company like this.
Right.
They want that customer to have multiple, different sources of revenue, so that you don't get in the case where it becomes a little bit more like a conventional government contractor relationship, rather than the more commercial approach where NASA buys seats from several vendors who sell seats to several people besides NASA as well. So that's going to play a factor in that as well. And also it'll depend on exactly what the companies propose in the proposals that they submitted to NASA earlier this year. How much money are they seeking? What do they plan to do with that? That's going to play a factor in determining how NASA can maximize the investment that they're going to make with the several $100 million they're going to devote to the CCICAP round.
Do you get the feeling, or let me rephrase that. I have heard the phrase mentioned that ATK is essentially selling back their own piece of the Constellation program. Taking the integrated solution from the Ares test flight and turning around and selling it back. Do you think that gives them an advantage? And if so, a fair one, an unfair one?
Well, it may give them an advantage. That they're basing on the same solid rocket motors that they've based that they use for the shuttle. Although they've actually never flown a 5-segment solid rocket booster, which is what they're proposing for Liberty. They've tested it on the ground. They've actually never flown it. Even the Ares 1X test flight back in 2009 was a 4-segment with a dummy 5th segment. And the upper stage is different this time around. The Ares 1X was going to use a brand new upper stage that Boeing was building using the J2X engine. Instead, with Liberty, they're using the core stage of the Ariane 5 rocket that Astrium builds. And that is a very successful rocket. It hasn't had a launch failure in nearly 10 years, on the order of 50 consecutive successful launches. But they're basically taking that core stage and using it in a new way. And that'll raise up some issues. But we also have to keep in mind that the companies that plan to use the ULA rockets, Boeing and Sierra Nevada and Blue Origin, are leveraging the investment that the Air Force in particular made in helping to develop and sustain the production of those rockets since the late 1990s.
True. I never thought about that.
That they put the Air Force put in some seed money to help develop the Atlas V back in the late 1990s. An almost somewhat analogous approach to what the Commercial Crew Program was, thinking that they could support both the Atlas V and Delta IV, which at that time was being built by Boeing. Lockheed Martin was building the Atlas V, and have two different vehicles that could serve the government but also serve commercial customers. The commercial launch market turned out to be smaller than they thought. There were some changes in the market. Companies that were going to provide a lot of launch demand, like Iridium and Teledesic, went into bankruptcy protection or went away entirely, and you saw Boeing and Lockheed merge their launch vehicle ventures into a single joint venture, United Launch Alliance, which builds the Atlas V and Delta IV now basically together, and primarily now for government customers. And the Air Force has helped sustain that program because they need those rockets for national security applications.
Sure. Yeah.
And so they're interested in seeing new users for these. So they're certainly interested in the role of Commercial Crew to help provide new markets and help reduce the need of the Air Force to help support those programs. But again, that program has been sustained at least in part through government money. So, ATK, yes, has some advantage with the investment that they got from the Constellation program, but they're not the only competitor there that's getting taking advantage of past government support for launch vehicle efforts.
Interesting, yeah. We touched there on Blue Origin being a dark horse for this, and Blue Origin throughout this whole process has personally kind of fascinated me because it is such a stark difference from the way that some of these other commercial providers do business. If you compare them to SpaceX, there is no comparison. Blue Origin is secretive and shrouded and close-knit, and you have SpaceX that is out there on social media, a very charismatic CEO going around and involved in all these other ventures. What do you think that affected them? Do you think that's the reason that they're kind of the dark horse now, or is it their hardware and their testing?
I think really they're the dark horse because they have their own business plan, their own plans to develop both suborbital and orbital vehicles. When Blue Origin started, they actually were focused on a suborbital vehicle that would take off and land vertically. They're still working on that, as well as their orbital vehicle, and they eventually have plans to develop a full-fledged reusable launch vehicle for orbital flights. So, Blue Origin initially said that they would launch their crew vehicle on an Atlas V, but eventually they've talked about developing their own reusable vehicle for that. But they're really proceeding at their own pace. And one advantage that Blue Origin has is they have a very wealthy backer in Jeff Bezos. We talk about Elon Musk and his ability to support SpaceX, but Jeff Bezos is in a whole other larger class in terms of wealth, and he's able to really sustain Blue Origin and keep it on its own pace without it having to worry to either go out and raise additional funding or seek government contracts to support development. If it doesn't get a CCICAP award, it can continue development just at a little different pace. And actually not having a government contract might suit them well in the long run because they can be a little more secretive when they're not getting taxpayer money. They actually had to open up to some degree to when they got the first and second round CC Dev awards because they're getting taxpayer money and they had to provide reports on the progress that they were making. So they actually opened up more than they had previously under that approach. So if they don't get an award, it might suit them just fine. They'd be perfectly happy to continue at their own slow, steady pace and eventually get there without having to worry about being paced by a particular government program or a need to raise tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in the private markets to support their efforts.
And their hardware failure that they sustained was not related to their CC Dev activities. That was their jumper, similar to the grasshopper concept that SpaceX has, right?
It was a suborbital demonstration vehicle. Yeah. So they emphasized that was not part of their CC Dev efforts. Mm-hmm. So, and that's one thing to keep in mind throughout this process is that there are going to be failures along the way. We're literally talking about rocket science. This is hard stuff. And SpaceX learned those lessons with the early development of Falcon 1. The first 3 Falcon 1 flights failed. They all failed for different reasons. And that's part of the learning process. But they incorporated those lessons, and every launch they've had since then, either the Falcon 1 or the Falcon 9, has been successful. But as we see more of these systems develop, particularly for those that are relying on new launch vehicles, the first launch of any new launch vehicle is a fairly risky endeavor because there are some things you can only test in a launch itself. You can test some things on the ground. You can try and simulate some things in thermal vacuum chambers, things like that. Sure. But you can really only test the whole integrated system, put it all together, and fire it off and see what happens. And undoubtedly, there are going to be launch failures, and hopefully there will not be any failures that involve crews. But we have to keep in mind that that's possible as well. That that there could be accidents involving crews going forward in either the orbital or even the suborbital realm as well. That there are. Spaceflight is inherently risky, and there are going to be some accidents along the way, and the biggest lesson is going to be how do we learn from those accidents and how do we pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and keep going.
And we saw, I was quite surprised to see pictures last week of SpaceX's the Grasshopper. I did not know that they were that close to real hardware tests, and they had the vehicle out there on the pad in is it McGregor is their testing facility?
That's correct.
What do you make of that? Do you think it seems like the vertical landing has been the holy grail, the fully reusable rocket. So many people have tried this. Do they have a chance of pulling it off?
Well, it's not going to be easy. I mean, launching rockets is hard enough as it is, but trying to return the rocket stages intact and be able to reuse them is even harder. And reusability has been the holy grail of space access, because if you can bring a rocket back and reuse it, you can basically amortize the development cost over a larger number of flights and really lower the cost of launching a satellite or some other spacecraft, and potentially open up new markets that can't afford launches right now. Reusability, though, is really hard. You have to get the vehicles back intact, and you have to be able to refurbish them, get them ready for launch, at a cost that is a fraction of what it takes to simply build a new one from scratch. And some of that, we learned from the space shuttle, that was a at least partially reusable system. The orbiter came back, the SRBs came back, the external tank didn't. But even those portions that came back required a lot of labor and a lot of time to get them ready for another flight, and that's one of the reasons why they had some very ambitious goals for the space shuttle in the 1970s in terms of how many launches a year it was going to do and expensive the launches were going to be, and they really learned that turning a vehicle around like that was much harder than they thought back then, and that's why the shuttle wasn't able to meet those goals in terms of flight rate or cost. As spectacular as the vehicle as it was, it was really took a lot of labor and a lot of time and a lot of money to get each shuttle ready for flight. Yeah,
and those engines, as I understand it, just the sheer output that went through the Space Shuttle main engines required a lot more maintenance than was originally thought, or a little more problematic than they had hoped in terms of reusability. Yeah. Well, I'm going to see if anyone has any questions at this point. We're about 15 till 5, and just going to pull up the old Google Plus window here. I saw a couple people commenting that they were watching, which is great. Sorry, just a second here. Find it. Okay, here we go. Comments, but no questions. Does anybody have a question for Jeff?
Can't believe I stumped the audience.
Yeah, it looks like we've got about 22 viewers right now, so hey, that's good. All right, well, if nobody has questions, maybe we can just cover a couple more quick topics before we have to sign off for the day. We go to the agenda here. So if you, I don't know if you like to make a claim on this, but if you had to guess, who do you think? We say SpaceX probably getting an award. Sierra Nevada just did their skid test, or part of their skid test, and was ready to do the full landing test on the Dream Chaser. Blue Origin's pusher system was shipped for testing. Boeing's been dropping their capsule out in the middle of the desert. Who do you think has it at this point out of those guys?
In terms of who are the most likely ones to get awards?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. And as I was saying earlier, it really depends on, in part, what they put into their proposals. What they're really asking NASA for, and what sort of priorities NASA has in terms of evaluating these proposals. You look at, if you assume that SpaceX, if you set aside SpaceX and say, based on what they've demonstrated, they'll probably get an award. We don't know what size award that they'll get, but we assume we'll get one. Then you've got, Boeing and Sierra Nevada and ATK competing for those other two awards. And, you could see perhaps, say, ATK, because they're developing a different launch vehicle, which could serve other markets besides commercial crew, as something nice to have. Boeing certainly has the heritage and experience in terms of building vehicles. Sierra Nevada has the advantage is that they're taking a little different technical approach. They have a lifting body vehicle that lands on a runway, and that has certain advantages over a capsule that lands, either splashes down or lands on airbags on land. That has certain advantages and capabilities to that might be interesting to pursue from a technical standpoint. So you can make a case for pretty much all of these, and I'm hesitant to handicap them because you really don't know what's going on with the source selection board within NASA that's evaluating that, what they're prioritizing, what they how much emphasis are they putting on, say, technical diversity in approaches, different launch vehicles, different spacecraft types, versus affordability, the cost of the systems. Versus what they think these companies are really capable of doing. Can they say what can they do what they say that they plan to do?
They actually, So, do you think Sierra Nevada has a PR advantage because they have a a miniature space shuttle, and America seems to be very nostalgic right now about their beloved space shuttles.
Yeah, I don't know if that really plays, something like that's going to play a role in the decision-making process.
Sure.
One thing I have noticed, actually, you talk about the PR. ATA actually, back in late June and early July, went on a fairly strong PR push. They put out a series of press releases almost once a day over the course of about a week, talking about some of the milestones that they had made under their unfunded Space Act agreement, or the announcement of an independent review board to examine their system. They actually, as a matter of fact, living here in the Washington, D.C. area, listening to an all-news radio station here, heard an ad for the Liberty system.
Oh, wow.
Radio ad. It was a very basic ad, playing up the partnership between ATK and Astrium to develop the Liberty system. But none of the other companies have done radio ads here. But I should note that this DC is a little different environment from the rest of the country. This is a radio station that was also playing ads comparing one missile defense concept over another missile defense concept from a competing company, when the ads aren't thick with political campaign ads, they're thick with your favorite fighter jet engine or tanker aircraft or missile defense system ad on that particular station. So you see people doing sort of a PR push like that. On that, question is, again, how effective is that going to be in the minds of the people who are ultimately going to be making the decision, which is going to be based on presumably much more quantitative, technical, and cost and other factors.
Yeah, I lived in D.C. myself for a little over a year, and I remember being pretty shocked when the metro pulled up to the Pentagon stop and seeing billboards, the lit billboards for, like you said, advertising fighter jets and missile defense contractors and things, and so advertising must pay when it comes to that. Well, we still got a couple more minutes here, and this is a big topic, but I thought maybe we could close out by just touching on it. Always like to talk about the monster rocket. As you pointed out, Senator Bill Nelson loves to call it that, the Space Launch System, the big rocket. So I just wanted to see if you had any insights on that, any news, the rumblings, insider news that you've heard recently about how development of that is going, how the political winds are shifting in favor or against the Space Launch System, or anything like that.
Yeah, there hasn't been a lot of developments with the SLS from a political standpoint. We saw the release from NASA just a few days ago. They were letting some contracts for some advanced booster studies.
Yeah. Initially,
the SLS is going to use 5-segment solid rocket motors for the strap-on boosters, similar to the 4-segment ones used for the space shuttle. But they're looking at concepts for advanced boosters that could replace them, be they solid or liquid fueled, that would help the SLS evolve from the 70-ton capacity it'll have initially up to that 130-ton ultimate capacity that they're talking about at some point in the 2020s, depending on funding and the continued development of the program overall, that would be useful for things like Mars missions. So, the real focus right now is working on the SLS concept, refining some of the designs for that initial system. They're still talking a 2017 initial test launch for the SLS. That will be an unmanned test launch. It'll carry an Orion spacecraft. It actually won't be the Orion's first flight. It'll fly a few years earlier atop a Delta IV Heavy on a test flight. Also, again, unmanned test flight. And then they're talking about having a crewed test flight of Orion and SLS in 2021. Now, the question is going to be, will the program still be around in 2021? And that's, as what we saw with Constellation, there's no guarantee that programs will survive from one administration to another, particularly if they're perceived to be behind schedule, over budget, simply not being a good investment. So that's going to be a challenge for NASA, is to demonstrate that the SLS is on track. That if there is a change of administrations next year, and there's new leadership in at NASA, perhaps different people in Congress that may not be as beholden to the SLS, as some of the members of Congress that helped secure funding for the SLS during the space policy debates a couple of years ago. The question would be, will the SLS survive? And if it doesn't survive, what will replace it?
What will replace it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting, but it's also worth noting. There's just an article I saw today by noted aerospace journalist Craig Cavolt. He'd looked at some Chinese literature. They're talking about a series of future launch vehicles, and they've got something called a Long March 9. Some of the Long March 9 concepts they have illustrated look very much like the SLS, right down to the use of solid fuel boosters.
Oh wow!
Which
interesting.
Really haven't used on their launch vehicles to date. You take one of those illustrations and put it next to some of the SLS concepts under study, and they look very similar. So I don't know if that how real this Long March 9 concept is, or how far in the future that this is going to be. But the Chinese are looking at a concept like this as well. Again, how serious they're willing to pursue this and how quickly they'll pursue it are open questions, but we're not the only country out there looking at some heavy lift launch vehicles.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, I'll check one last time if anybody had any questions for you. Browse over here. All right, no questions. Well, anyway,
the audience.
Yeah. We'll throw questions out to the audience. Yeah. Well, yeah. So I guess we'll sign off then. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for sacrificing what was sure to be a fun event, I'm sure, with the SpaceX crew and seeing Dragon. Hope you get to see it again soon. And talking with me. Really appreciated it and had a good chat.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Jason. It's been a fun hour. It's always fun talking about topics like this. There's a lot of interesting things going on. There's going to be a lot more interesting things going on, not just this summer, but into the fall and into the next year as well, as some of these vehicles get built or maybe don't get built in some places, and we start to see some more test flights and launches, and eventually getting some suborbital and orbital crewed space flights in the next couple of years. So a lot of things to look forward to, and it's going to be an exciting ride coming up. So thanks again for the invitation. I'd love to be on the show.
Thanks. Just again, this is Jeff Foust, and he can be found at the Space Review. That's www.thespacereview.com. New Space Journal, www.newspacejournal.com, and a little space politics over at www.spacepolitics.com. He's also on Twitter. Feel free to look him up, follow him, and follow all the latest in commercial space. So thanks again, Jeff. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Jason.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.